In what is probably the greatest example of poking the bear ever, Japan, through its Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, launched a surprise military strike on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii on Sunday, December 7, 1941. The attack was a bolt from the blue, as at the time America was a neutral country in World War II. It was only after this act of aggression that America formally entered the war on the Allies' side. Code-named Operation AI, or Hawaii Operation by the Japanese military leadership, the attack on Hawaii was the culmination of months of careful and covert planning. Leading up to the incident, the Japanese and Americans were locked in negotiations over the Pacific region, an area the Japanese referred to as the Southern Resource Area. Among the issues under discussion was Japan's access to the resources in the region. The Japanese intended the attack as a preventive action to keep the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with their planned military actions in Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States. To achieve this, the Japanese intended to destroy the American fleet that was stationed in the Pacific. By targeting the American Pacific Fleet, they hoped that America's ability to mobilize its forces in that region would be severely curtailed. Over the course of several months, Operation AI gathered steam, with extensive pilot training and logistical preparations the top priority. The Japanese would loosely base their tactics around a similar attack carried out by the British on the Italian fleet at Taranto just the year before. The operation, spearheaded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then commanding Japan's combined fleet, began much earlier but only got the initial green light from the Emperor Hirohito on November 5, 1941. The operation was not without its doubters, as some prominent figures and advisors close to the emperor felt it would result in failure. Some feared that an attack on America would inevitably lead to a direct military confrontation, which they were not confident of winning, and it would thus reverse all the gains that had been made through negotiations. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese striking force, comprising of 6 aircraft carriers, departed Hitokapa Bay on Etorofo Island, en route to a position northwest of Hawaii. On board the 6 carriers were a combined total of 365 aircraft. The operation was divided into 2 waves of attack. The first wave would be the primary attack aimed at capital targets such as battleships, with dive bombers within the first wave tasked with attacking ground targets and parked aircraft. A second wave would then deliver a final blow to any targets left standing by the first wave. In the morning of December 7, 1941, just after 7:45 a.m., a swarm of Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon unannounced, catching the Americans by surprise. As the first wave approached Oahu, a U.S. Army training post picked up the approaching formation on radar and reported it to one Private Joseph McDonald, who was stationed at Fort Shafter's Intercept Center near Pearl Harbor. Coincidentally, an American B-17 bomber was scheduled to arrive that same day from California, from the same direction as the Japanese planes were coming from, and thus the formation on the radar screen was mistakenly assumed to be that of the B-17 bomber. The advancing Japanese formation soon entered Oahu airspace, shooting down several American aircraft they encountered as they made the approach to Hawaii. American ships off the harbor entrance attempted in vain to warn of the impending danger, but it was too late. The first wave of Japanese aircraft was already upon them before the warnings could be processed. Leading the first wave, torpedo bombers, whose targets were mostly the battleships, dropped 49 800 kilograms armor-piercing bombs, with 8 reportedly hitting their target. A further 40 torpedoes were also dropped, with 17 scoring at direct hits. Of the notable targets was the aircraft carrier USS Arizona, whose destruction also happened to be directly responsible for nearly half of all the fatalities suffered by the Americans on the day. The Arizona suffered 4 direct hits during an attack by 10 Japanese planes which dropped multiple armor-piercing bombs. The first bombs to make a direct hit ricocheted off the face of the turret and penetrated the captain's pantry, causing a fire. The last of the bombs is believed to have penetrated the Arizona's explosive-filled magazine, which led to its detonation, resulting in a massive cataclysmic explosion. The explosive force ripped apart the interior structure of the forward part of the ship. This caused the forward turrets and conning tower to collapse downwards and the foremast and funnel to collapse forward, effectively tearing the ship in two. So powerful was the blast that debris showered down on Ford Island. The ship went down afterwards. Unlike most of the ships attacked on that day, Arizona's damages were so extensive that the wreck was never recovered or repaired even to this day. A repair vessel, Vestal, moored next to Arizona, suffered collateral damage and was heavily damaged and breached due to the sheer force of the explosion. Another casualty was the USS Nevada, which suffered extensive damage after being torpedoed. Attempts were made to move the Nevada out of harbor, but this only exposed her to further assaults by Japanese bombers as she limped out of harbor. All attempts to rescue her were abandoned when fires started to overcome the servicemen on board, leading to her deliberate beaching to avoid risking blocking the harbor entrance if she sank there. Also to suffer a direct hit was the USS California, which received direct hits from 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. A decision was made to abandon ship when they realized that fire from the burning fuel that was escaping from USS West Virginia was slowly making its way towards the ship. USS West Virginia, Oklahoma, Maryland, and Utah would follow suit when they were all torpedoed, with the former suffering the most damage after a total of 7 torpedoes landed direct hits. The torpedoes hit her on her port side, while bombers hit her with a pair of 16-inch armor-piercing shells that had been converted into bombs. The first bomb had penetrated the superstructure deck, causing massive damage to the casemates below. Secondary explosions of the ammunition stored in the casemates caused serious fires there and the gallery deck below them. The second bomb struck the rear, super-firing turret roof. So severe was the damage that the rudder was ripped apart by a torpedo. The ship was only saved from capsizing through the quick damage control efforts initiated by ship's assistant fire control officer. Leaking fuel soon ignited and flames engulfed the ship. Efforts to put out the fire were made impossible by additional fuel leak from the Arizona encroaching into West Virginia's path. The fire took until the next day to be extinguished. USS Oklahoma was struck by 3 torpedoes in rapid succession, with the first and second hitting it just seconds apart. The torpedoes caused much damage as they were 20 feet or 6 meters below the waterline between the smokestack and mainmast. The torpedoes blew away a large section of her anti-torpedo bulge. The third torpedo struck moments later, penetrating the hull and destroying the adjacent fuel bunkers on 2 platform decks and rupturing access trunks to the 2 forward boiler rooms. She began to capsize, but not before 2 more torpedoes landed further direct hits. Within 12 minutes, she had rolled over and came to halt with her masts touching the bottom, her starboard side above water, and a part of her keel exposed. It is believed the ship took as many as 8 hits in total. During the attack, only USS Nevada managed to maneuver out of its mooring and return fire. As Nevada's gunners opened fire and raised steam, a single torpedo struck her above keel. She was able to return fire and shot down the bomber that had dropped the torpedo. The torpedo bulkhead held, but leaking through the joints caused flooding of the port side compartments below the first platform deck. Although damaged, Nevada managed to proceed as the crew corrected the list by counterflooding. By now, Nevada had managed to shoot down 4 planes, thus making it a main target of the Japanese bombers. Japanese pilots intended to sink her in the channel, ostensibly to block the harbor. Nevada was struck by a further 5 bombs, with one exploding over the crew's gallery at frame 80. 2 more struck the forecastle near frame 15, with one exploding within the ship near the gasoline tank. Leakage and vapors from this tank caused intense fires aboard the Nevada. Fortunately, the main magazine had been empty, and the fire did not result in a catastrophic demise as had transpired on the Arizona. Nonetheless, the damage became apparent, and Nevada was ordered to proceed towards the shallow waters to avoid sinking in deep water. She was then deliberately grounded off Hospital Point, but not before she downed a further 3 enemy planes. Of all the battleships, USS Maryland suffered the least damage. Having been struck by 2 armor-piercing bombs, Maryland managed to stay afloat despite flooding. The Japanese even reported the Maryland as having been sunk during the attack, but this latter proved to be incorrect as she managed to limp to port for repairs just 30 days later. The destruction was not limited to battleships alone, as light cruisers and destroyers also bore the brunt of the Japanese torpedoes. A torpedo struck the light cruiser Helena, and the resultant blast capsized a mine layer which was moored beside it. The torpedoes were proving to be causing the most damage, with 2 destroyers, Cassin and Downes II, falling victim to their destruction power. The 2 destroyers were in dry dock when their tanks were ruptured, leading to a fire outbreak from the leaking fuel. In an attempt to put out the fire, the Americans flooded the dock, but this only made matters worse as the burning fuel rose with the water. The Cassin then slipped from her keel blocks and rolled against Downes. Closely behind were the dive bombers who went straight for the air bases across Oahu. The dive bombers unleashed a salvo of artillery volleys on Hickam Field first before proceeding to Wheeler Field. This was clearly by design, as these were the largest and main U.S. Army Air Force's fighter bases, respectively. The objective was to ensure that the U.S. Air Force is crippled and unable to fight back or follow the Japanese after the attack. Of the 402 American aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged. Due to the surprise nature of the attack, almost all planes were not ready for takeoff to defend the base. Thus, 155 planes were damaged on the ground. Only 8 planes managed to get airborne during the time of the attacks. They were responsible for the downing of at least 1 Japanese aircraft. There were 33 PBY Catalinas stationed in Hawaii at the time of the attack, of which 30 were destroyed. The only PBY Catalinas to escape undamaged were the ones which were on patrol during the time of the attacks. A further 3 planes that were in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor were shot down by the Japanese. These were civilian planes, resulting in the first civilian casualties of the attack on Pearl Harbor. To add to the civilian casualties were 9 members of the Honolulu Fire Department who died when they responded to the fire at Hickam Field. Exact details of how they met their demise vary, but it is widely reported that a bomb fell through the roof of a hangar in which 2 firefighters were battling a blaze, killing both men. Another firefighter was killed by machine gun fire from one of the Japanese planes. The 2 bases suffered extensive damage and loss of life, with a combined casualty of 122 deaths and over 400 wounded. 1.5 hours after the attacks had begun, 2,403 American servicemen lay dead, and 1,178 were wounded. A total of 18 ships were either sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. The attack was over, and the Japanese formation withdrew into the Pacific Blue, leaving behind them a trail of destruction. Now the Americans were left to count the cost of the loss. From the Arizona alone, a total of 1,177 of the 1,512 crewmen on board at the time were lost. Approximately half of the lives lost during the attack were aboard the Arizona. 106 men were also killed aboard USS West Virginia, 429 aboard Oklahoma, 2 aboard Maryland, 104 aboard California, and 60 aboard Nevada. The Japanese, though victorious on the day, were not without losses themselves. The Americans had managed to down 29 planes, leading to the loss of over 50 Japanese servicemen. A further 74 planes sustained damage from the Americans returning fire. Nonetheless, the losses paled in comparison to the damage they had inflicted on the Americans. The Japanese had scored a resounding victory, or so they thought. Check out the next episode as we discuss the aftermath of the attack and America's response in Chapter 2 of the series. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel.